Hello, happy quarantine story time, everybody. I'm Charlotte, and I am live again with more War and Peace. I know you guys have been dying to see what's going on. Hey, I got the live chat up, so feel free to drop a line, say hey, any feedback you may have, or thoughts or comments, or just give a shout out. My mama is here, my #1 fan. Hi, Mom. I hope the microphone is better today. So the microphone I'm using today is the same one as yesterday. I've taken off the pop filter because the one I have clips on. It doesn't seem to clip on super well to this microphone. So I thought I'd just see what the sound quality is without the pop filter. But I don't think that was the problem with yesterday's sound. I'm sorry it was so low. I think the problem with yesterday's sound was there is a way to control the sensitivity of the mic, like how much it picks up. And I didn't realize that the default was like the lowest. And it's not very well labeled, so that's kind of a detractor for this microphone. Not that it was so quiet, but just that it's kind of not as user-friendly as to like determine. And even when it's a knob, and the knob doesn't have any like markings on it to indicate what position it's in, so whether it's low or high. So I'm just going off the fact that you couldn't hear me yesterday was probably really too low. So spinning it today, and hopefully I won't be too loud. We'll see. It's an adventure. But hopefully it looks like from like my microphone bar on the screen that it's picking up a little bit more. Mom, since you're on the chat, just let me know if it sounds like the regular sound level. Otherwise I can adjust it up. Okay, it's good. Great. Awesome. Well, guys, today is a long reading, so I don't want to belabor the points too much today because we are down to volume 4, the final part in volume 4. But I do need to have a caveat that there is a lengthy epilogue afterwards that we will be reading because I think it wraps up a lot of things with the characters. But the final part, part 4 of volume 4, I think is most easily broken up into 2 parts. So I think we'll just do 2 longer readings today and tomorrow to finish part 4 this week. And then we can start the epilogue next week and hopefully be finished by the end of next week or the middle of the following week. So hopefully by the beginning of September, we will be done, friends. And we can move on to other books. I know Mom dropped some ideas of classic books in there. I think I will research like which of those, if there's any like restrictions on some books you can't read aloud on YouTube, evidently for copyright reasons. So I'll research that. I also want to tell you that all Jane Austen is out and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte is out because they're favorites of mine. I've read pretty much everything of Jane Austen, so there's no novelty there for me, and I feel like it's not as fair to you guys. And I know Jane Eyre like the back of my hand, so I could practically just recite it for you. So we're not going to do that. We're going to try to go for a book that's maybe new for all of us. But I will look at the list, and if anyone else has any ideas, feel free to drop them in the comments or live chat here or comments on the video. I welcome that. And any thoughts you have on the microphones. Like I said, there was Friday and Monday have been the same, just like whether or not I'm using the pop filter, and Tuesday was a different mic, and then yesterday and today are the same mic. So I think Friday I'll try that microphone from Tuesday just to kind of see sound quality. I'll do a few other tests. But yeah, if you have more ideas, drop them in. And yeah, so let's get going. As we ended the last chapter with young Petya Rostov got killed when he was attacking a convoy of the French with Denisov and Dolokhov, and with his youth and inexperience and just sort of idealized version of reality, idealized version of war, he went just running into battle and got shot, as happens with a lot of people. And so unfortunately he is dead. But in that convoy that they attacked, which they did take, there was Pierre Bezukhov. So Pierre is now safely with Denisov and Dolokhov, though Dolokhov is the man he dueled with and he shot. So there could be some bad blood there. But let's just see what is going to happen. So let me bring this in a little closer. I'm going to try using the microphone up here today and look directly at you, friends. Sorry for the wobbliness. Suddenly this little tabletop is not as Well, let me know if it starts to get quiet. Let's try this. So Volume 4, Part 4, Section 1. When a man sees a dying animal, horror comes over him. That which he himself is, in his essence, is obviously being annihilated before his eyes, is ceasing to be. But when the dying one is a person, and a beloved person, then besides a sense of horror at the annihilation of life, there is a feeling of severance and a spiritual wound which, like a physical wound, sometimes kills and sometimes heals, but always hurts and fears any external irritating touch. After the death of Prince Andrei, Natasha and Princess Maria equally felt that. Morally bowed down and shutting their eyes to the menacing cloud of death that hung over them, they did not dare to look life in the face. They carefully protected their open wounds from any offensive, painful touch. Everything, a carriage driving quickly down the street, a reminder of dinner, a maid's question about what dress to prepare, still worse, a word of insincere, weak sympathy, everything painful irritated the wound, seemed offensive, and violated the necessary quiet in which they both tried to listen to the dread, stern choir, not yet silenced in their imagination, and prevented them from peering into those mysterious, infinite distances which for a moment had opened before them. Only together were they not offended or pained. They spoke little between themselves. When they spoke, it was of the most insignificant subjects. They both equally avoided mentioning anything that had a relation to the future. To acknowledge the possibility of a future seemed to them an offense to his memory. Still more carefully did they avoid in their conversation all that might have been a relation to the dead man. It seemed to them that what they had lived through and felt could not be expressed in words. It seemed to them that any mention in words of the details of his life violated the majesty and sacredness of the mystery that had been accomplished before their eyes. A continual restraint of speech, a constant careful avoidance of all that might lead to words about him, these halts on the side at the border of what could or could not be spoken, brought out still more purely and clearly in their imagination what they both felt. But pure, perfect sorrow isn't impossible as pure and perfect joy. Princess Maria, in her position as the sole independent mistress of her fate, the guardian and instructor of her nephew, was the first to be called away by life and the world of sorrow in which she lived for the first 2 weeks. Called away by life from the world of sorrow in which she lived for the first 2 weeks. She received letters from relations which had to be answered. The room in which Nikolenka had been placed was damp, and he began to cough. Alpatych came to Yaroslav with business reports and with suggestions and advice to move to Moscow to the house on Vizdivizenka, which had remained intact and only needed minor repairs. Life did not stop, and one had to live. Hard as it was for Princess Maria to leave the world of solitary contemplation in which she had lived till then, sorry and as if ashamed that she was to leave Natasha alone, the cares of life called for her participation, and she involuntarily surrendered to them. She went over the accounts with Alpatych, consulted with Dessalles about her nephew, and gave instructions and made preparations for moving to Moscow. Natasha remained alone, and once Princess Maria began preparing for departure, avoided her as well. Princess Maria suggested that the Countess allow Natasha to come with her to Moscow, and the mother and father gladly accepted this suggestion, noticing the daily decline in their daughter's physical strength, and supposing that the change of place and the help of Moscow doctors could be good for her. "I won't go anywhere," replied Natasha when the suggestion was made. "Only please leave me alone," she said, and ran out of the room, barely holding back her tears, not so much of grief as vexation and anger. After she felt herself deserted by Princess Maria and solitary in her grief, Natasha spent most of her time, alone in her room, sitting with her legs tucked up at the corner of the sofa while tearing or kneading something with her thin, tense fingers, stared with an intent, fixed gaze at whatever her eyes rested on. The solitude exhausted her, tormented her, but it was necessary for her. The moment someone came in, she got up quickly, changed her position and the expression of her gaze, and took up a book or some sewing, waiting for with obvious impatience for whoever had troubled her to leave. It kept seeming to her that she was just on the point of understanding, of penetrating that terrible, overwhelming question at which her inner gaze was directed. At the end of December, Natasha, in a black woolen dress, her hair braided carelessly done up in a knot, thin and pale, was sitting with her legs tucked up at the corner of the sofa, tensely crumpling and smoothing out the ends of her sash, looking at a corner of the door. She was looking there where he had gone, to the other side of life, and that side of life, of which she had never thought before, which before had seemed so far off and incomprehensible, was now closer and dearer, more comprehensible to her than this side of life, where everything was either emptiness and ruin or suffering and offense. She was looking there, where she knew he was, but she could not see him otherwise than as he had been here. She saw him again as he had been in Maestici, at the Trinity, in Yaroslav. She saw his face, heard his voice, and repeated his words and the words she had said to him. Sometimes she invented new words for herself and for him, which might have been said then. Here he is lying in an armchair in his velvet coat, his head propped up on his thin, pale hand. His chest is terribly sunken and his shoulders are hunched. His lips are firmly compressed, his eyes glitter, and a wrinkle springs up and then disappears on his pale forehead. One of his legs trembles rapidly, barely noticeably. Natasha knows that he is struggling with tormenting pain. What is this pain? Why pain? What is he feeling? How it hurts him, thinks Natasha. He noticed her attention, raised his eyes, and without smiling began to speak. One thing is terrible, he had said. It is to bind yourself forever to a suffering man. That is eternal torment. And he looked at her. Natasha could see it now, with a searching gaze. Natasha, as always, had answered then, before she had time to think of what answer she would give. I cannot go on like this. It won't be. You'll get well, completely. She now saw him anew and lived through all she had felt then. She remembered his prolonged, sad, stern gaze at those words, understood the meaning of the reproach and despair in that prolonged gaze. I agreed, Natasha now said to herself, that it would be terrible if he was left suffering always. I said it then only because it would be terrible for him, but he understood it differently. He thought it would be terrible for me. He still wanted to live then. He was afraid of death. And I said it to him so crudely, so stupidly. I didn't think that. I thought quite differently. If I had said what I thought, I would have said, let him be dying all the time before my eyes. I would still be happy compared to what I am now. Now, there's nobody, nothing. Did he know that? No, he didn't know, and he'll never know now. And now it will never, never be possible to put it right. And again he was saying the same words to her, but now in her imagination Natasha answered him differently. She stopped him and said, terrible for you, but not for me. You know that for me there is nothing in life without you, and to suffer with you is the best happiness for me. And he took her hand and pressed it as he had pressed it on that terrible evening 4 days before his death. And in her imagination she said other tender, loving things to him, which she might have said then, and which she was saying now. I love you. You, I love, she said, convulsively pressing her hands together, clenching her teeth with a violent effort. And a sweet sorrow came over her, and tears already welled up in her eyes. But suddenly she asked herself, to whom is she saying this? Where is he, and who is he now? And again everything was veiled in a dry, hard perplexity, and again tensely knitting her brows and peering there where he was. It seemed to her she was just about to penetrate the mystery, but at the moment when the incomprehensible seemed to be revealed, her hearing was painfully struck by a loud rattling of the door handle. Quickly and heedlessly, with a frightened look on her face, unconcerned with her, the maid Dunyasha came into the room. Please go to your father quickly, said Dunyasha, with a peculiar and animated expression. A misfortune about Pyotr Ilyich. A letter, she said with a sob. Section 2. Besides a general feeling of alienation from all people, Natasha experienced at that time a peculiar feeling of alienation from the persons of her own family. All of them, her father, her mother, Sonia, were so close, so habitual, so humdrum, that all their words and feelings seemed to her an insult to that world in which she had been living recently. And she was not only indifferent, but looked at them with hostility. She heard Dunyasha's words about Pyotr Ilyich, about the misfortune, but she did not understand them. What sort of misfortune is there for them? What sort of misfortune could there be? With them it's their old, habitual, and peaceful thing, Natasha said to herself. When she entered the reception room, her father was quickly coming out of the countess's room. His face was pinched and wet with tears. He had clearly run out of that room in order to let loose the sobs that were choking him. Seeing Natasha, he waved his arms desperately and broke into painfully convulsive gasps, which disfigured his round, soft face. Patrick, go, she's calling. And weeping like a child, quickly moving his weakened legs, he went over to a chair and almost fell into it, covering his face with his hands. Suddenly, it was as if an electric shock ran through Natasha's whole being. Something hit her terribly painful in the heart. She felt a terrible pain. It seemed to her that something had torn inside her and she was dying. But after the pain, she suddenly felt free of the ban on life that had laid on her. Seeing her father and hearing her mother's terrible, coarse cry from behind the door, she instantly forgot herself and her grief. She ran to her father, but he, strengthlessly waved his hand, pointed to the door to her mother's room. Princess Marya, pale with a trembling lower jaw, came out of the door and took Natasha by the hand, saying something to her. Natasha did not hear her. With a quick step, she went through the door, stopped for a moment as if struggling with herself, and ran to her mother. The countess was lying in an armchair, stretched out somehow strangely, awkwardly, and beating her head against the wall. Sonia and the maids were holding her by the arms. "Natasha, I want Natasha," cried the countess. "It's not true, it's not true, he's lying, I want Natasha," she cried, pushing away everyone around her. "Get out of here, all of you, it's not true. Killed. Ha, 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 it's not true." Natasha placed her knee on the chair, bent over her mother, embraced her, and raised her with unexpected strength, turned her face towards her, and pressed herself to her. "Mama, darling, I'm here, my dearest Mama," she whispered to her, not pausing for a second. She would not let go of her mother, struggled with her gently, called for pillows, water, unbuttoned and tore open her mother's dress. "My dearest, my darling Mama, dear heart," she whispered ceaselessly, covering her head, hands, face, and feeling the tears flowing irrepressibly in streams, tickled her nose and cheeks. The countess pressed her daughter's hand, closed her eyes, and became calm for a moment. Suddenly, with unwonted quickness, she got up, looked around senselessly, and seeing Natasha, began pressing her head with all her strength. Then she turned her daughter's face to her, which was wincing with pain, and peered into it for a long time. "Natasha, you love me," she said in a soft, trustful whisper. "Natasha, you won't deceive me. You'll tell me the whole truth." Natasha looked at her with tear-filled eyes, and there was nothing in her face but a plea for forgiveness and love. "My dearest Mama," she repeated, straining with all force of her love towards her so as to somehow shift onto herself the excess of grief that was crushing her. And again, in her strengthless struggle with reality, her mother, by refusing to believe that she could live while her beloved boy had been killed in the flower of life, tried to save herself from that reality in a world of insanity. Natasha did not remember how that day passed, nor the night. The next day, the next night. She did not sleep and did not leave her mother's side. It was as if Natasha's love, persistent, patient, not as an explanation, not as a consolation, but as a summons to life, enveloped the countess on all sides every second. On the third night, the countess calmed down for a few minutes, and Natasha closed her eyes, resting her head on the arm of the chair. The bed creaked. Then Natasha opened her eyes. The countess was sitting on the bed and speaking softly. "I'm so glad you've come. You're tired. Would you like some tea?" Natasha went to her. "You've grown handsome and manly," the countess went on, taking her daughter by the hand. "Mama, what are you saying?" "Natasha, he's no more, no more." And embracing her daughter for the first time, the countess began to weep. Section 3. Princess Marya postponed her departure. Sonia and the count tried to replace Natasha, but could not. They saw that she alone could keep her mother from insane despair. For 3 weeks, Natasha was constantly with her mother, slept in the armchair in her room, made her drink and eat, and talked ceaselessly with her. Talked because only her gentle, caressing voice could soothe the countess. A wound in the mother's soul could not heal. Petya's death tore away half of her life. A month after the news of Petya's death, which had found her a fresh and cheerful 50-year-old woman, she came out of her room an old woman, half dead and taking no part in life. But the same wound that half killed the countess, this new wound called Natasha to life. A wound in the soul coming from the rending of the spiritual body, strange as it may seem, gradually closes like a physical wound. And once a deep wound heals over and the edges seem to have knit, a wound in the soul, like a physical wound, can be healed only by the force of life pushing up from inside. This was the way Natasha's wound healed. She thought her life was over, but suddenly her love for her mother showed her that the essence of life, love, was still alive in her. Love awoke and life awoke. Prince Andrei's last days had bound Natasha and Princess Marya together. The new misfortune brought them still closer. Princess Marya postponed her departure and for the last 3 weeks looked after Natasha like a sick child. Those last weeks, which Natasha spent in her mother's room, undermined her physical strength. Once in the middle of the afternoon, noticing that Natasha was shivering feverishly, Princess Marya brought her to her own room and made her lie down on her bed. Natasha lay down, but when Princess Marya lowered the blinds and was about to leave, Natasha called her to her. I don't want to sleep. Sit with me, Marie. You're tired. Try to sleep. No, no. Why did you take me away? She'll ask for me. She's much better. She talks so nicely today, said Princess Marya. Natasha lay on the bed and studied Princess Marya's face in the semi-darkness of the room. Does she resemble him? Thought Natasha. Yes, she does, and doesn't, but she's special, a stranger, quite new, unknown, and she loves me. What's in her heart? All good things, but how? How does she think? How does she look at me? Yes, she's wonderful. Masha, she said timidly, drawing her hand towards her. Masha, you don't think I'm bad, do you? No? Masha, darling, how I love you. Let's be best friends. And embracing Princess Marya, Natasha started kissing her hands and face. Princess Marya was abashed and overjoyed at this expression of Natasha's feelings. From that day on, a passionate and tender friendship was established between Princess Marya and Natasha, such as occurs only between women. They constantly kissed each other, spoke tender words to each other, and spent most of their time together. If one went out, the other became uneasy and hastened to join her. The two felt a great harmony between themselves that separately than separately each felt with herself. A stronger feeling than friendship was established between them. It was the exceptional feeling that life was possible only in each other's presence. Sometimes they were silent for hours at a time. Sometimes, already in bed, they would start talking and talk till morning. They talked mostly about the distant past. Princess Marya told her about her childhood, about her mother, her father, her dreams, and Natasha, who formerly turned away with calm incomprehension from that life of devotion and submission, from the poetry of Christian self-denial, now feeling herself bound by love to Princess Marya, also came to love Princess Marya's past and to understand a formerly incomprehensible side of life. She did not think of applying submission and self-denial to her own life because she was used to seeking other joys, but she understood and came to love this formerly incomprehensible virtue in another. For Princess Marya, as she listened to the stories of Natasha's childhood and early youth, a formerly incomprehensible side of life was also revealed. Faith in life, in the pleasures of life. As before, they still never spoke of him, so as not to violate with words, as it seemed to them, that lofty feeling that was in them. And this silence about him had the effect that little by little, without believing it, they began to forget him. Natasha had grown thin, pale, and become so weak physically that everyone constantly spoke of her health, and that pleased her. But sometimes she was unexpectedly overcome not only by the fear of death, but by the fear of illness, weakness, the loss of beauty, and involuntarily she sometimes studied her bare arms, amazed at its thinness, or in the morning contemplated in the mirror her drawn, and as it seemed to her, pathetic face. It seemed to her that it ought to be so, but at the same time she felt afraid and sad. One time she went quickly up the stairs and got completely out of breath, and at once she involuntarily thought up for herself some business downstairs, and from there ran up again, testing her strength and observing herself. Another time she called Dunyasha, and her voice cracked. She called her once more, though she heard her footsteps, called in that chesty voice in which she used to sing, and listened attentively to it. She did not know it, she would not have believed it, but under the seemingly impenetrable layer of silt that covered her soul, thin, tender young needles of grass were already breaking through, which were to take root and so cover with their living shoots the grief that oppressed her, that it would soon not be seen or noticed. The wound was healing from the inside. At the end of January, Princess Marya left for Moscow, and the Count insisted that Natasha go with her so as to consult the doctors. After the clash at Vyazma, where Kutuzov could not hold back his troops from their wish to overrun, cut off, and so on, the further movement of the fleeing French and pursuing Russians until Krasno went without battles. The flight was so swift that the pursuing Russian army could not keep up with the French. The horses of the cavalry and artillery balked, and the information about the movement of the French was always wrong. The men of the Russian army were so exhausted by this constant movement at 30 miles a day that they could move no faster. To understand the degree of exhaustion of the Russian army, one need only understand clearly the meaning of the fact that, having lost no more than 5,000 wounded and killed since Torrentino, and no more than 100 as prisoners, the Russian army, which numbered 100,000 when it left Torrentino, numbered 50,000 when it reached Krasno. The swift movement of the Russians after the French had the same disastrous effect on the Russian army as the flight of the French on theirs. The only difference was that the Russian army moved voluntarily without the threat of destruction which hung over the French army, and that the French sick, lagging behind, remained in the foe's hands, while the Russian sick remained at home. The chief cause of the diminution of Napoleon's army was the swiftness of its movement, and the corresponding diminution of the Russian army serves as an unquestionable proof of it. Kutuzov's whole activity, as at Torrentino and Vyazma, was aimed only at not stopping, insofar as it was in his power, the movement so destructive for the French, as the Russian generals in Petersburg and in the army wanted to do, but at contributing to it and at making the movement of his own troops easier. But besides that, once the troops had shown the fatigue and enormous losses caused by the swiftness of movement, Kutuzov had one more reason for slowing down and waiting. The aim of the Russian army was to follow the French. The path of the French was unknown, and therefore the more closely our troops followed on the heels of the French, the greater the distance they covered. Only by following at a certain distance could they make shortcuts in the zigzag path that the French took. All the skillful maneuvering proposed by the generals was expressed in terms of moving troops and multiplying marches, while the only reasonable goal consisted in diminishing marches, and it was towards this goal that Kutuzov's activity was directed through the campaign from Moscow to Vilno, not accidentally, not temporarily, but so consistently that he never once betrayed it. Kutuzov knew, not by reason or science, but with all his Russian being, he knew and felt that what every Russian soldier felt, that the French were defeated, that the foe was fleeing and had to be driven out. But along with that, he felt, together with the soldiers, all the difficulty of this march, of unheard-of swiftness, and at such a time of the year. But to the generals, especially the non-Russian ones, who wished to distinguish themselves, to astonish someone, to take prisoner, God knows why, some duke or king, to these generals it now seemed that when any battle was both nasty and senseless, was just the right time to give battle and defeat someone or other. Kutuzov merely shrugged his shoulders when presented with projects, one after another, for maneuvers involving those ill-shod, coatless, half-starved soldiers who in a month, without any battles, had melted away by half, and who, under the best conditions for the continuing flight, would have to cover more space to reach the border than what they had already gone through. This striving to be distinguished and to maneuver, to overrun and cut off, was especially manifest when the Russian troops ran across the French. It happened that way at Krasno, when they thought they would find one of the 3 French columns and stumble upon Napoleon himself with 16,000 men. Despite all the means employed by Kutuzov to avoid that disastrous crash and spare his troops, the worn-out men of the Russian army spent 3 days at Krasno finishing off the beaten mob of the French. Toll wrote a disposition, Die erste Kolonne Merschet, and so on, and as always everything was done not according to the disposition. Prince Eugene of Württemberg fired from a hill at the crowds of the Frenchmen running by and called for reinforcements which did not come. The French, going around the Russians by night, scattered, hid in the forest, and made their way each man as he could. Miloradovich, who used to say that he did not want to know anything about the material affair of his detachment, who could never be found when he was needed, Chevalier sans peur et sans reproche, as he called himself, a knight without fear and without reproach, and a great lover of parleys with the French, kept sending envoys calling for surrender, and lost time and did not do what he was ordered to do. I make you a gift of that column, lads, he would say, riding up to the troops and pointing out the French to his cavalrymen, and the cavalrymen, urging on their scrawny, battered, barely moving horses with spurs and sabers, after mighty exertions trotted up to the column given to them, that is, to a crowd of frostbitten, numb with cold and hungry Frenchmen. And the column given to them dropped its weapons and surrendered, something it had long been wanting to do. At Krasno they took 26,000 prisoners, hundreds of cannon, some stick which was called a marshal's baton, and disputed over who had distinguished himself there, and were pleased with that, but very much regretted that they had not taken Napoleon, or at least some hero or marshal, and for that reproached each other, and especially Kutuzov. These people, carried away with their passions, were merely the blind executors of the most grievous law of necessity, but they considered themselves heroes and imagined that they had done was a most worthy and noble thing. They accused Kutuzov and said that from the very start of the campaign he had prevented them from defeating Napoleon, that he had thought only about satisfying his passions and did not want to leave Polotnany Zavadi because he felt comfortable there, that he had stopped moving at Krasno because, having learned of Napoleon's presence, he was completely at a loss, that it was conceivable that he was in a conspiracy with Napoleon, that he had been bribed by him, and so on and so forth. It was not enough that contemporaries, carried away by their passions, spoke this way. Napoleon has been recognized as grand by posterity and history, and Kutuzov by foreigners as a cunning, depraved, feeble old courtier. But the Russians as some infinite, a sort of puppet, useful only because of his Russian name. Section 5. In the years 12 and 13, Kutuzov was directly accused of blunders. The sovereign was displeased with him, and in a history written not long ago at the highest injunction, it was said that Kutuzov was a cunning court liar, fearful of the name of Napoleon, who through his blunders at Krasno and at the Berezina deprived the Russian army of the glory of a complete victory over the French. Bogdanovich's History of the Year 1812, Characteristics of Kutuzov and Considerations of the Insufficient Results of the Fighting at Krasno. Note by Tolstoy. Such is the destiny not of great men, not of the grands hommes, who the Russian mind does not recognize, but of those rare, always solitary men who, discerning the will of Providence, submit their personal will to it. The hatred and contempt of the crowd punish these men for their insight into the higher law. For Russian historians, strange and terrible to say, Napoleon, the most insignificant instrument of history, who never and nowhere, even in exile, displayed any human dignity. Napoleon is the object of admiration and enthusiasm. He is grand. While Kutuzov, a man who from the beginning to the end of his activity in 1812, from Borodino to Vilno, while always being true to himself in all his acts and words, shows an example uncommon in history of the self-denial and awareness in the present of the future significance of the event. Kutuzov seems to them something indefinite and pathetic, and when they speak of Kutuzov and the year 12, it is as if they were always slightly embarrassed. And yet it is hard to imagine a historical figure whose activity was so invariably and constantly directed towards one and the same goal. It is hard to imagine a goal more worthy and more concurrent with the will of the whole people. It is harder still to find another example in history in which the goal that the historical figure set for himself was so perfectly attained as the goal towards which the entire activity of Kutuzov was directed in the year 12. Kutuzov never spoke of 40 centuries looking down from the pyramids, of the sacrifices he was making for the fatherland, of what he intended to accomplish or had accomplished. He generally said nothing about himself, did not play any role, always seemed a most simple and ordinary man, and said this most simple and ordinary things. He wrote letters to his daughters and to Madame de Staël, read novels, enjoyed the society of beautiful women, joked with generals, officers, and soldiers, and never contradicted people who wanted to prove something to him. When Count Rostopchin galloped up to Kutuzov on the Yaouza bridge with personal reproaches, blaming him for the destruction of Moscow, and said, "Didn't you promise not to abandon Moscow without giving battle?" Kutuzov replied, "And I won't abandon Moscow without a battle," though by then Moscow had already been abandoned. When Arakcheev, coming to him from the sovereign, said that Ermolov must be appointed commander of the artillery, Kutuzov said, "Yes, I just said the same thing," though the moment before he had said something quite different. What did he care who, amidst the muddle-headed crowd around him, alone then understand all the immense meaning of the event? What did he care if Count Rostopchin attributed the calamity of Moscow to him or to himself? Still less could he be concerned about who was appointed the commander of the artillery. Not only in these cases, but constantly, this old man who, through the experience of life, had received the conviction that thoughts and the words which serve to express them are not what move people, spoke completely meaningless words, the first that came to his head. But this same man, so heedless of his words, never once in all his activity spoke a single word that was not consistent with the one goal towards the attainment of which he went during the whole time of the war. Obviously, unwillingly, with the painful certainty that he would not be understood, he voiced his thought more than once, in the most varied circumstances. Starting from the Battle of Borodino, when his dissension with his entourage began, he alone said that the Battle of Borodino was a victory, and repeated it orally and in reports and in dispatches till the day he died. He alone said that the losses of Moscow was not the loss of Russia. In response to Lauriston's proposal of peace, he said that there could be no peace because such was the will of the people. He alone, during the French retreat, said that all our maneuvers are unnecessary and everything was getting done by itself better than we could wish, and that the enemy should be given a golden bridge, that the battles of Tarantino, Vyazma, and Krasno were unnecessary, that they had to have some men left when they got to the border, that he would not give up one Russian even for 10 Frenchmen. And he alone, this courtier, as they portray him, the man who lied to Arikchiv in order to curry favor with the sovereign, he alone, this courtier, said in Vilno, thereby earning disgrace from the sovereign, that a further war beyond the border is harmful and useless. But words alone could not prove that he understood the significance of the event. His actions, without the least deviation, were directed towards one and the same goal, which was made up of three things. 1. To strain all his forces in the clash with the French. 2. To defeat them. And 3. To drive them out of Russia, alleviating as far as possible the distress of the people and the army. He, this temporizer, Kutuzov, whose motto is patience and time, the enemy of all decisive action, gives battle at Borodino, clothing the preparations for it in unparalleled solemnity. He, this Kutuzov, who before the Battle of Austerlitz begins, says it will be lost, at Borodino, despite the assurances of the generals that the battle has been lost, despite the example of unheard of in history of an army having to retreat after winning a battle, he alone, contradicting everyone, maintains till his dying day that the Battle of Borodino was a victory. He alone, during the whole time of the retreat, insists on not giving battle, which was now useless, on not beginning a new war, on not crossing the borders of Russia. If we do not apply to the activity of the masses goals that existed only in the heads of a few dozen people, it is easy now to understand the significance of the event, because the whole event and its consequences lie before us. But how was it that this old man, alone, contrary to the opinion of all, could then guess so correctly the significance of the national meaning of the event that during his whole activity he never once betrayed it? The source of this extraordinary power of penetration into the meaning of events taking place lay in that national feeling which he bore within himself in all its purity and force. Only the recognition of that feeling in him made the people choose him in such a strange way, him, an old man in disgrace, against the will of the Tsar, as representative of the national war, and only that feeling placed on him, on that loftiest human height, from which he, the commander-in-chief, directed all his powers, not at killing and destroying people, but at sparing and pitying them. This simple, modest, and therefore truly majestic figure could not fit into that false form of the European hero, the imaginary ruler of the people which history has invented. For a lackey there can be no great man, because a lackey has his own idea of greatness. Section 6. The 5th of November was the first day of the so-called Battle of Krasno. Before evening, already many dispatches and mistakes of the generals who had not gone where they were supposed to after sending out of adjutants with counter-orders, when it had already become clear that the enemy was fleeing everywhere and there could not and would not be any battle, Kutuzov left Krasno and rode to Dubrow, where the headquarters had been transferred that day. The day was clear, frosty. Kutuzov, with an enormous suite of generals, who were displeased with him and whispered behind his back, rode towards Dubrow, mounted on his fat white horse. Parties of French prisoners taken that day, 7,000 had been taken, crowded along the road, warming up by fires. Not far from Dubrow, an enormous crowd of ragged prisoners, wrapped and covered in whatever they could find, buzzed with talk, standing on the road by a long line of unhitched French guns. As the commander-in-chief approached, the talk ceased, and all eyes were fixed on Kutuzov, who, in his white cap, with red band and a padded greatcoat that hunched up on his stooping shoulders, slowly moved along the road. One of the generals was reporting to Kutuzov about where the guns and prisoners had been taken. Kutuzov seemed to be preoccupied with something and was not listening to the general's words. He narrowed his eyes with displeasure and peered attentively and fixedly at the figures of the prisoners, who were particularly pathetic sight. The greater part of the French soldiers' faces were disfigured by frostbitten noses and cheeks, and almost all of them had red, swollen, and festering eyes. A bunch of Frenchmen were standing close to the road, and two soldiers, the face of one covered with sores, was tearing a piece of raw meat with their hands. There was something terrible and animal-like in the fleeting glance they cast at the passerby, and the spiteful expression with which the soldiers with their swords, having glanced at Kutuzov, immediately turned away and went on with what he was doing. Kutuzov gazed long and attentively at these two soldiers, wrinkled his face still more, narrowed his eyes, and shook his head pensively. In another place, he noticed a Russian soldier who was saying something affectionately to a Frenchman, laughing and patting him on the back. Kutuzov again shook his head with the same expression. "What are you saying? What's that?" asked the general, who went on reporting and was drawing the commander-in-chief's attention to the captured French standards that stood in front of the Preobrazhensky regiment. "Ah, standards," said Kutuzov, clearly having difficulty tearing himself away from this subject that occupied his thoughts. He looked around absent-mindedly. Thousands of eyes were looking at him from all sides, waiting for a word from him. He stopped in front of the Preobrazhensky regiment, sighed deeply, and closed his eyes. Someone from the suite waved to the soldiers holding the standards to come and place them, staff down, around the commander-in-chief. Kutuzov was silent for a few seconds, and with evident reluctance, submitting to the necessity of his position, raised his head and began to speak. Crowds of officers surrounded him. He gazed attentively at the crowd of officers, recognizing some of them. "I thank you all," he said, turning to the soldiers and again to the officers. In the silence that reigned around him, his slowly articulated words could be heard distinctly. "I thank you all for your difficult and faithful service. The victory is complete, and Russia will not forget you. Glory to you forever." He paused, looking around. Lower its head," he said to a soldier who was holding the French eagle and had inadvertently inclined it before the Preobrazhensky standards. Further, like that." "Hurrah, lads," he said with a quick movement of his chin, addressing the soldiers. "Hurrah!" Thousands of voices cheered. While the soldiers were shouting, Kutuzov, hunching up in his saddle, bent his head, and his eyes lit up with a meek as if a mocking glint. "Here's the thing, brothers," he said when the voices died down. And suddenly his voice and expression of face changed. It was no longer a commander-in-chief speaking, but a simple old man who obviously now wished to tell his comrades something they needed most of all. There was a movement in the crowd of officers and in the rank of soldiers so that they could hear more clearly what he was going to say now. "Here's the thing, brothers. I know it's hard for you, but what's to be done? Be patient, it won't last long. We'll see our guests off, then we'll have a rest. The Tsar will not forget your service. It's hard for you, but you're still at home. But see what they've come to," he said, pointing to the prisoners. "Worse than the lowest beggars. While they were strong, we took no pity on ourselves, but now we can pity them. They're also people, right, lads?" He looked around, and in the intent, respectfully puzzled eyes directed at him, he read sympathy with his words. His face began to grow brighter and brighter, starting from the old man's meek smile that wrinkled star-like from the corners of his mouth and eyes. He paused, hung his head as if in perplexity. But that said, who's invited them here? It's their own doing. He suddenly said, raising his head, and swinging his whip, he rode off at a gallop for the first time in the whole campaign, while the soldiers, breaking ranks, joyfully guffawed and roared, "Hurrah!" The words spoken by Kutuzov were hardly understood by the troops. No one would have been able to convey the contents of the field marshal's, at first solemn and in the end simple-hearted old man's speech, but the heartfelt meaning of that speech was not only understood, but that same feeling of majestic triumph, combined with pity for the foe and the consciousness of his rightness, expressed precisely by that old man's good-natured oath, that same feeling lay in the hearts of every soldier, expressed itself in a joyful, long-drawn-out shout. After that, one of the generals addressed him with the question whether the commander-in-chief would be ordering a carriage brought. Kutuzov, in answering, sobbed unexpectedly, evidently deeply moved. Section 7. The 8th of November, the last day of the battles at Krasno, it was already dark when the troops came to their night camp. The whole day had been quite clear, frosty, with light, sparse snow falling. Towards evening it began to clear. The deep, purple, starry night could be seen through the snowflakes, and the frost began to deepen. The musketeer regiment, which on leaving Tarantino had numbered 3,000, now numbered 900 men, was one of the first to come to the place appointed for the night camp, in a village by the high road. The quartermasters who had met the regiment announced that all the cottages were taken up by sick and dying Frenchmen, cavalrymen, and staff. There was only one cottage for the regimental commander. The regimental commander rode up to his cottage. The regiment went through the village, and stacked muskets by the last cottage on the road. Like a huge, many-limbed animal, the regiment began the work of arranging its den and food. One part of the soldiers wandered off through knee-deep snow into birch woods to the right of the village, and at once the chopping of axes and swords, the crack of breaking branches, and the merry voices were heard from the woods. Another part pottered around the center of the regimental carts and horses, bunched together, taking out pots, biscuits, and feeding the horses. A third scattered through the village, arranging lodgings for the staff, carrying away the dead bodies of the French that lay in the cottages, and collecting boards, dry wood, and straw from the roofs for campfires, and wattle fences for shelter. Behind the cottages at the edge of the village, some 15 soldiers with merry shouts were loosening the high wattle side of a shed from which the roof had already been removed. "Ready now, all at once! Heave!" cried the voices, and in the darkness of the night, a huge snow-dusted section of the wall swayed with a frosty creaking. The lower stakes cracked more and more, and the wall finally fell over together with the soldiers pushing on it. There were loud, coarsely joyful shouts and guffaws. "Take it by twos! Reach me the lever there! That's it! Where are you shoving? Now, all at once! Wait up, lads! At the shout!" And they fell silent, and a soft, velvety, pleasant voice began singing a song. At the end of the third verse, just as the last sound ended, 20 voices shouted out together, "Ho! Here goes! All at once! Up with it, boys!" But despite their concerted efforts, the wall hardly budged, and in the ensuing silence, heavy panting could be heard. "Hey, you 6th Company! Damn you devils! Give us a hand! We'll also do for you!" Some 20 men of the 6th Company, who were on their way to the village, joined the haulers, and the wattle wall, with about 35 feet long and 7 feet high, curving, crushed, and cutting the shoulders of the panting men, moved on down the village street. "Keep on, will you? Look out, it's falling! What did you stop for? That's it!" The merry, outrageous cursing never ceased. "What's with you?" Suddenly came the commanding voice of a soldier who ran into the carriers. "There's gentry here. The general himself's in the cottage, and you damn foul-mouthed devils, I'll give it to you," cried the sergeant major, and he swung and struck the first soldier who came along on the back. "Can't you do it quietly?" The soldiers fell silent. The soldier struck by the sergeant major, groaning, began to wipe the blood from his face, which he had scratched as he bumped against the wall. "See how the devil fights! My mug's all bloody," he said in a timid whisper, when the sergeant major had walked on. "Don't you love it?" said a laughing voice, and holding down the sounds of their voices, the soldiers went on. Once outside the village, they began again to talk just as loudly, interspersing their talk with the same pointless curses. In the cottage that the soldiers had passed, the high command had gathered, and a lively conversation was going on over tea about the past day and the proposed maneuvers to come. It was proposed to make a flanking march to the left to cut off the viceroy and capture him. When the soldiers were lugging the wattle wall, the cook fires were already kindling in various places. The firewood cracked, the snow melted, and the black shadows of the soldiers darted here and there on the trampled snow all over the occupied space. Axes and swords were at work on all sides. Everything got done without any orders. A supply of firewood was brought for the night. Little lean-tos were set up for the officers, pots boiled, guns and ammunition were put in order. The wattle wall brought by the 8th Company was set up in a half circle on the north side, propped with stakes, and a campfire was built in front of it. They beat the tattoo, called the roll, ate supper, and settled for the night by the campfires, some mending their footwear, some smoking their pipes, and some, stripped naked, steaming out lice. Section 8. What are you... okay, I don't have time to read all that right now. Section 8. It would seem that in those almost unimaginably hard conditions of existence in which the Russian soldiers found themselves at that time, without warm boots, without winter coats, without a roof over their heads, in the snow at 18 degrees of frost, without even a full ration of provisions, which did not always keep up with the army, it would seem that the soldiers must present a very sad and dejected spectacle. On the contrary, never, in the very best material conditions, did an army present a more cheerful, lively spectacle. That came from the fact that each day all those who began to lose heart or strength were thrown out of the army. All those who were physically and morally weak had long since stayed behind, leaving only the flower of the army in strength of spirit and body. The 8th Company, sheltered by the wattle wall, gathered the most people of all. 2 sergeants major joined them, and their campfire blazed brighter than the others. They demanded an offering of firewood for the right to sit by the wall. "Hey, Makib, you! Did you get lost or did the wolves eat you? Fetch that firewood," shouted a red-mugged, red-haired soldier, squinting and blinking from the smoke, but not moving away from the fire. "Crow, you go at least and fetch some firewood," the soldier addressed someone else. The redhead was not a sergeant or a corporal, but he was a lusty soldier and therefore ordered around those who were weaker than he. The skinny, small, sharp-nosed soldier who had been called Crow obediently got up and was about to go and carry out the orders, but just then the slender, handsome figure of a young soldier carrying a load of firewood came into the light of the campfire. "Give it here, that's great!" The wood was broken up, laid on, blown at, fanned with the skirts of greatcoats, and the flames hissed and crackled. The soldiers moved up and lit their pipes. The handsome young soldier who had brought the firewood set his arms akimbo and began stamping his chilled feet quickly and deftly in place. "Cold as in the dew. Ah, mother syllable, how good. I'll be a musketeer," he sang along as if hiccuping at each syllable of the song. "Hey, your soles will fly off," cried the redhead, noticing that one of the dancer's shoes was loose. "Swallowed dancing poison." The dancer stopped, tore off the loose piece of leather, threw it onto the fire. "Right you are, brother," he said, and sitting down, took a scrap of blue French broadcloth from his pack and began wrapping his foot in it. "It's the steam does it," he said, stretching his feet out to the fire. "Well, we'll get new ones soon. They say we've killed them off. We'll all get double the goods." "And see, that son of a bitch Petrov fell behind all right," said one sergeant major. "I had an eye on him for a long time," said the other. "Some soldier boy. And in the 3rd Company, I heard there were 9 men missing yesterday." "Yes, but figure, once your feet are frozen, how are you going to walk?" Empty chatter," said the sergeant major. "Or do you want the same thing?" said an old soldier, turning reproachfully to the one who had talking about frozen feet. "And what do you think?" the sharp-nosed soldier called as Crow began in a squeaky and trembling voice, suddenly raising up from behind the campfire. "A sleek man gets thin, but for a thin man it's death. Me, for instance, I can't stand it anymore," he suddenly said resolutely, turning to the sergeant major. "Order me sent to the hospital. I hurt all over. I'll fall behind anyway." "Well, that'll do, the sergeant major said calmly. The little soldier fell silent, and the conversation went on. "Quite a few of those Frenchmen got taken today, but to say it straight out, not one of them had a real pair of boots on. Just in name only." One of the soldiers began a new subject. "The Cossacks always take them. We cleaned the cottage for the colonel. We carried some of them out. It's a pity to see, lads," said the dancer. "We unwrapped them. One is still alive. Believe me, he babbled something in his own talk." "But they're clean folk, lads," said the first. White as that birch, and gallant, you might say, noble fellows." "But what did you think? He has them recruited from all the classes." "But they don't know anything of our talk," the dancer said, with a perplexed smile. "I say to him, 'Whose crown are you under?' and he babbles in his own way. Funny folk." "There's this puzzler, brothers," the one who had been surprised at their whiteness went on. "The muzhiks at Muzhaisk said, when they started clearing away the dead where the battle was, so you can reckon it's a whole month their dead were lying there. So they say, some of them lying there, they say, white as paper, clean, not a whiff of them." "What, from the cold or something?" asked one of them. "Smart one you are, from the cold. It was hot then. If it had been from the cold, ours wouldn't have gone bad either. But they say you go up to one of ours, and he's all rotten and wormy. So they say we'd cover ourselves with handkerchiefs and turn our mugs away as we dragged them out. Couldn't stand it, but theirs, they say, white as paper, and not a whiff of them." They all fell silent. "Must be the food," said the sergeant major. "They ate Gentry's grub." Nobody objected. That Muzhik was telling, the one there at Mozhaisk where the battle was. It took 10 villages to cart them off, and they were 20 days at it, and there was still some dead left. There were so many wolves, they say. "That was a real battle," said the old soldier. "So there's something to remember, but everything after, it's just only to make folks suffer." "That's right, uncle. 2 days ago we made a rush, but nothing doing. They wouldn't let us get at them. Dropped their muskets quick. Fell on their knees. 'Pardon,' they said. That's just one example. They say Platov took Napoleon himself twice. Doesn't know a word. So they take him. He turns into a bird in their hands and flies away. Just flies away. And there's also no permit to kill him." "You're lying your head off, Kiselev, as I'm looking at you." "How lying? It's the real truth. If I had it my way, I'd catch him and bury him right in the ground and put an aspen stake through his heart. He's destroyed a lot of folk." "Well, we'll put an end to him one way or another. He won't be around long," said the old soldier, yawning. The conversation ceased. The soldiers began settling down to sleep. "Look at the stars, burning away something awful. You'd say it was women spreading sheets," a soldier said, admiring the Milky Way. "That means a good harvest this year. We'll need more firewood." "You warm your back and your belly gets cold. It's funny." "Oh, Lord. What are you shoving for? Is the fire for you alone or something? Look at him sprawling." Silence was now settling in, and several sleepers could be heard snoring. The others turned and warmed themselves, occasionally exchanging words. From a campfire some 100 paces away came a chorus of merry guffaws. "Look at how they're roaring in the 5th Company," said one soldier. "And so many folk. It's awful." One soldier got up and went to the 5th Company. "They're having fun there," he said, coming back. "2 Frenchmen have joined them. One's completely frozen, but the other one's pretty frisky. He's playing songs." "Oh, let's go see." Several soldiers went over to the 5th Company. Section 9. The 5th Company was camped just by the forest, an enormous campfire burning brightly amidst the snow, lighting up the boughs of the trees heavy with hoarfrost. In the middle of the night, the soldiers of the 5th Company had heard footsteps in the snow of the forest and the cracking of twigs. "That's a bear, lads," said one soldier. They all raised their heads and listened, and from the forest 2 human figures emerged in the bright light of the fire, holding on to each other and strangely dressed. They were 2 Frenchmen who had been hiding in the forest. Saying something hoarsely in a language the soldiers did not understand, they came up to the fire. One was taller, wearing an officer's hat, and looked quite weak. Coming to the fire, he wanted to sit down, but fell to the ground. The other, a small, stocky soldier, his cheeks tied around with a kerchief, was stronger. He lifted his comrade up and, pointing to his mouth, said something. The soldiers surrounded the Frenchman, laid the sick man on an overcoat, and brought some kasha and vodka for them, both. The weak French officer was Rambal. The one tied round with a kerchief was his orderly, Morel. When Morel had drunk some vodka and finished a mess tin of kasha, he suddenly became morbidly merry and began rattling something out to the soldiers who did not understand him. Rambal refused to eat and lay silently by the fire, propped up on his elbow, looking at the Russian soldiers with vacant red eyes. From time to time he let out a long moan and fell silent again. Morel, pointing to his shoulders, tried to bring it home to the soldiers that this was an officer and that he needed to get warm. A Russian officer who came up to the fire sent to the colonel to ask if he would take in a French officer to get warm. The answer came back that the colonel ordered the officer brought. Rambal was told to go. He stood up and tried to walk, but staggered and would have fallen if a soldier standing beside him had not supported him. "What, you don't want to?" one soldier said, addressing Rambal with a mocking wink. You fool, don't talk nonsense." A real loud reproaches against the joking soldier came from all sides. Rambal was surrounded. 2 men made a seat with their hands, picked him up, and carried him into the cottage. Rambal put his arms around the soldier's neck as they carried him, kept saying pitifully, "Oh, mes braves, oh, mes bons, oh, mes bons amis, voilà des hommes, oh, mes braves, mes bons amis. Oh, my fine fellows, oh, my good friends, here's men for you. Oh, my fine fellows, my good friends." And like a child, he rested his head on one of the men's shoulders. Meanwhile, Morel was sitting in the best place, surrounded by soldiers. Morel, a stocky little Frenchman with inflamed, watery eyes, with a kerchief tied woman-like over his cap, was dressed in a woman's coat. Evidently tipsy, he put his arms around the soldiers sitting next to him and sang a French song in a hoarse, faltering voice. The soldiers held their sides, looking at him. Come on, teach me. How does it go? I'll learn it right away." "How does it go?" said the joker singer whom Morel was embracing. "Vive Henri Quatre, vive Savoy Vallon," sang Morel, winking. "C'est diable et Quatre." Long live Henry IV, long live that valiant king, that quadruple devil. "Vivrika, fif saruva, c'est diablaka," the soldier repeated, waving his arm and indeed catching the motif. "Well done! Ho, 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 ho!" Coarse, joyful guffawing rose on all sides, and Morel, puckering up, also laughed. "Well, go on, more. "Qu'eut le trip talent de boire de batterie et d'entrer en vers galant." Who had the triple talent, to drink, to fight, and to be a hearty gallant. "That also goes nicely. Well done, Zaletev." "Cue," Zaletev brought out with effort. "Cue," he drew out, diligently protruding his lips. "Le triptala di bu di ba I d'être velaga," he sang. That's great. There's a Frenchman for you. Ho, ho, ho. What, you want more to eat? Give him more kashka. If you don't get full soon when you don't get full soon when you're starving. They again offered him kasha, and Morel, chuckling, started on his third mess tin. Joyful smiles lingered on the faces of the young soldiers looking at Morel. The old soldiers, considering it improper to be taken up with such trifles, lay on the other side of the campfire, but getting up on an elbow every once in a while, they glanced smilingly at Morel. There are also people, one of them said, wrapping himself in his greatcoat. Even wormwood grows on its root. Oh, Lord, Lord, what an awful lot of stars. It'll be freezing cold. And everything became still. The stars, as if knowing that no one could see them now, frolicked in the black sky, now flaring up, now going out, now quivering. They busily whispered among themselves about something joyful but mysterious. Section 10. The French troops uniformly melted away in a mathematically regular progression. Of the troops of the Berzina, of which so much had been written, was only one of the intermittent steps in the destruction of the French army, and not at all a decisive episode of the campaign. If so much had been written, and is being written, about the Berzina, that is so on the French side only because, on the broken bridge over the Berzina, the calamities that the French army had formerly been undergoing regularly, here suddenly grouped together in one moment and in one tragic spectacle that stayed in everyone's memory. On the Russian side, there had been so much talking and writing about the Berzina, only because, away from the theater of war in Petersburg, a plan was drawn up, by the same Paful, for catching Napoleon in a strategic trap on the river Berzina. Everyone was confident that in reality everything would be done exactly as in the plan, and therefore insisted that it was precisely the crossing of the Berzina that destroyed the French. As a matter of fact, the result of the crossing of the Berzina was far less destructive for the French in the losses of ordnance and prisoners than Krasno, as the numbers show. The sole significance of the crossing of the Berzina lies in the fact that this crossing proved obviously and unquestionably the fallacy of all the plans for cutting off and the correctness of the sole possible course of action demanded by Kutuzov and the entire mass of troops, of merely following the enemy. The crowd of the French was running at a constantly increasing force of speed, with all its energy directed at achieving its goal. It ran like a wounded animal, and it was impossible to stand in its way. This was proved not so much by the arrangement of the crossing as the movement on the bridges. When the bridges were broken down, the unarmed soldiers, the Moscow inhabitants, the women with children who were in the French transport, everyone, borne on by the force of inertia, did not surrender but ran ahead into the boats onto the freezing water. That impulse was reasonable. The position of both the fleers and the pursuers was equally bad. Remaining with their own, each of them, in his distress, hoped for help from his comrades, hoped to occupy a definite place among his own. Surrendering to the Russians, he would be in the same situation of distress, but would stand on a lower step in sharing the satisfaction of the necessities of life. The French did not need to have correct information about the fact that half the prisoners, whom no one knew what to do with, perished of cold and hunger, despite all the desire of the Russians to save them. They sensed that it could not be otherwise. The most compassionate Russian commanders and lovers of the French, even the French and Russian service, could do nothing for the prisoners. The French perished from the distress in which the Russian army found itself. It was impossible to take bread and clothing from hungry and much-needed soldiers in order to give it to the not harmful, not hated, not guilty, but simply unneeded French. Some did so, but that was only an exception. Behind lay certain destruction. Ahead lay hope. The boats were burned. There was no other salvation except joint flight, and all the forces of the French were directed at that joint flight. The further the French fled, the more pathetic their remnants, especially after the Berzina, in which, owing to the Petersburg plan, special hopes were placed. The more strongly burned the passions of the Russian commanders as they accused each other, and especially Kutuzov. Supposing that the failure of the Petersburg plan for the Berzina would be attributed to him, they expressed their dissatisfaction with him, their contempt for him, and mockery of him more and more strongly. The mockery and contempt, it goes without saying, more expressed in respectful form, and such that Kutuzov could not even ask what he was being accused of and why. They did not speak seriously with him, reporting to him or asking his permission. They had the air of fulfilling a mournful ritual, but behind his back they winked and tried to deceive him at every step. All these people, precisely because they could not understand him, were convinced that there was no point in talking with the old man, that he would never understand all the profundity of their plans, that he would reply to them with his phrases, they thought they were only phrases, about a golden bridge, about the impossibility of crossing the border with a crowd of vagrants, and so on. They had already heard all of that from him, and all that he said, for instance, that they should wait for provisions, that the men had no boots, all that was so simple, while all they had proposed was so complex and clever, that it was obvious to them that he was old and stupid, and they were, though not in authority, were commanders of genius. Especially after the union with the army of the brilliant admiral and Petersburg hero Wittgenstein, this mood and the staff gossip reached the highest limit. Kutuzov saw it, and only shrugged his shoulders with a sigh. Only once, after Berzina, did he get angry and write to Bennigsen, who reported separately to the sovereign the following letter. By reason of your bouts of illness, be so good, your excellency, upon receipt of this present, to go to the Kaluga and wait there for the further command and appointment from his imperial majesty. But following the sending away of Bennigsen, the Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich came to the army. He had participated in the beginning of the campaign and had been removed by Kutuzov. Now the Grand Duke, having come to the army, informed Kutuzov of the displeasure of the sovereign emperor at the poor success of our troops and the slowness of their movement. The sovereign emperor intended to come to the army himself any day. The old man, as experienced in court affairs as in military, the same Kutuzov who in August of that year had been chosen commander-in-chief against the will of the sovereign, the same one who had removed the heir and the Grand Duke from the army, who, on his own authority, in opposition to the sovereign's will, had decreed the abandoning of Moscow. That Kutuzov now understood at once that his time was up, that his role had been played, and that he no longer had that imaginary authority of his. He understood it was not only by the attitude of the court. On the one hand, he saw that the military business in which he had played his role was finished, and he felt that his mission was fulfilled. On the other hand, he began to have that same time to feel physical weariness in his old body and the necessity of physical repose. On the 29th of November, Kutuzov rode into Vilno, into his good old Vilno, as he used to say. Twice during his service, Kutuzov had been governor of Vilno. In wealthy, unscathed Vilno, apart from the comforts of life he had long been deprived of, for so long, Kutuzov found old friends and memories. And suddenly, turning away from all military and state affairs, he immersed himself in the regular, habitual life, insofar as he was left in peace by the passions that boiled around him, as if all that was being accomplished now, and had yet to be accomplished in the historical world, did not concern him in the least. Chikagov, one of the most passionate cutters-off and overrunners, Chikagov, who at first had wanted to take a diversion to Greece and then to Warsaw, had in no way wanted to go where he was ordered. Chikagov, known for his boldness of speech with the sovereign, Chikagov, who considered himself Kutuzov's benefactor, because when he was sent in the year 11 to conclude a peace with the Turks over Kutuzov's head, and found out that peace had already been concluded, he acknowledged before the sovereign that the merit of having concluded the peace belonged to Kutuzov. This same Chikagov was the first to meet Kutuzov in Vilno, at the castle where Kutuzov was to stay. Chikagov, in naval undress uniform, with a dagger, holding his peaked cap under his arm, handed Kutuzov a formal report and the keys to the city. That contemptuously respectful attitude towards the senile old man expressed itself in the highest degree in the whole manner of Chikagov, who already knew the accusations made against Kutuzov. While talking with Chikagov, Kutuzov told him, by the way, that the carriages with sets of dishes captured from him in Borisov were safe and would be returned to him. C'est pour me dire que je n'ai pas ce quoi manger. Je peux en contre vous former de tout dans le cas même où vous voudrez donner des dîners. You mean to say I have nothing to eat from? On the contrary, I can furnish you with everything in case you should want to give dinners, Chikagov said, flushing with each of his words, wishing to prove his rightness, and therefore supposing that Kutuzov was concerned with the same thing. Kutuzov smiled his subtle, perceptive smile, and shrugging his shoulders replied, Ce n'est que pour vous dire ce que je dis. I only mean to say to you what I'm saying. Contrary to the will of the sovereign, Kutuzov stationed the greater part of the troops in Vilno. Kutuzov as those around him said, went extraordinarily to seed and became weaker physically during this stay in Vilno. He was reluctant to occupy himself with army matters, leaving everything to his generals, and, awaiting the sovereign, gave himself up to a dissipated life. Leaving Petersburg on the 7th of December with his suite, Count Tolstoy, Prince Volkonsky, Arikchev, and others, the sovereign arrived in Vilno on the 11th of December and drove straight to the castle in his traveling sleigh. At the castle, despite the severe frost, several hundred generals and staff officers in full dress uniforms and honor guard of the Semyonovsky Regiment, A courier galloping up to the castle with a sweating troika ahead of the sovereign shouted, "He's coming!" Konovnitsyn rushed to the front hall to report to Kutuzov, who was waiting in the porter's little lodge. A minute later, the old man's large, fat figure in full dress uniform, with all his regalia covering his chest and a sash tied tightly around his belly, came wobbling out to the porch. Kutuzov put on his service cap, took his gloves in his hand, and, negotiating the steps with difficulty, went sideways down the stairs and took in his hand the report prepared for presentation to the sovereign. Scurrying about, whispers, another troika desperately flying by, and all eyes turning to the jolting sleigh in which the figures of the sovereign and Volkonsky could already be seen. From a habit of 50 years, all this had a physically agitating effect on the old general. He patted himself all over with anxious haste, straightened his cap, and just as the sovereign stepped out of the sleigh, raised his eyes to him, he at once braced himself, stood to attention, handed over the report, and began speaking in his measured, ingratiating voice. The sovereign looked Kutuzov up and down with a quick glance, frowning momentarily, but then, getting the better of himself at once, went up, and spreading his arms, embraced the old general. Again, from an old habitual impression, and in relation to his innermost thoughts, this embrace, as usual, affected Kutuzov. He sobbed. The sovereign greeted the officers, the Semyonovsky guard, and, shaking the old man's hand once more, went ahead with him into the castle. Left alone with the field marshal, the sovereign voiced to him his displeasure with the slowness of the pursuit, with the mistakes of Krasno and the Berzina, and informing him of his consideration about the future campaign abroad. Kutuzov made no objections or comments. The same submissive and vacant expression with which 7 years earlier he had listened to the sovereign's orders at the field of Austerlitz now settled on his face. When Kutuzov came out of the study and with his heavy, dipping gait, lowering his head, went through the reception room, someone's voice stopped him. "Your Serenity," someone said. Kutuzov raised his head and looked for a long time into the eyes of Count Tolstoy, who stood before him with some small object on a silver samovar. Kutuzov seemed not to understand what was wanted of him. Suddenly, it was as if he remembered. A barely noticeable smile flashed across his puffy face, and with a low, respectful bow, he took the object that lay on the salver. It was the Order of St. George, first degree. And that's the end of section 10, and that's where we'll stop it for today. Thank you for sticking around for the extra long reading. Like I said, we should finish section 4, or part 4, and volume 4 tomorrow for the end of the week, and we can start the epilogue on Monday. Very exciting. Exciting to the... I wonder if Tolstoy was... I have to look at the history of Tolstoy because it's interesting that there's a Count Tolstoy in the story, and I mean, it could be a common name, but I just wonder if that was actually him, like if he was involved, and that's why he speaks of all of this in such a first-person manner. I always kind of like Kutuzov, that old general who just kind of slowly gets things done. He doesn't need to rush about for the intrigues and the all these honors, but he gets them anyways. So yeah. Let's see. We've got some stuff over here. Mom said 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, Beloved by Toni Morrison, Things Fall Apart by Chiwetel Ejiofor, Cain by Jean Toomer, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Onto Zora Neale Hurston, Kindred by Octavia Butler, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, Ain't I a Woman by Bell Hooks, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, Not Without Laughter by Langston Hughes. Yeah, lots of great looking books here, lots of them that are on my to-read list. I think I'm just going to go out and repeat what I said before, which is a lot of these newer books I don't think we can read on YouTube because of copyright copyright law. I think I'd have to get permission from the author and their publisher before we could read any of them. So I feel like my haircut looks uneven. So I'm gonna just say, again, I think we'll have to look to older classic literature, and something that would still be in the public domain. But yes, thank you for all of these great ones. Passage to India by Ian Forster, that might be older, so that might work. But yeah, I'll look at all of them. If anyone else has any remarks, go ahead and drop me a line. Let me know how you think this microphone sounds. Like I said, I don't love the interface of it as much as some of the other ones, but we'll do some more tests and see what comes. I'm not going to keep you guys too much longer because it has been a long read, and I thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you tomorrow again. Have a great day. Stay safe. Bye.